Thank you, everybody. I realize this is a pretty ambitious topic, putting down all things water and then having 30 minutes to talk about it in a 30-minute panel. We're not going to get to all things water, so I'll go ahead and just say that right now. I did want to take us through a couple items that are not necessarily related to our farming here, but I want to start with something that's incredibly important from a regulatory standpoint. Thank you to the NVG and Caleb and everybody asked to talk a little bit about where we are with our groundwater in Napa County. And so the question is, what can we expect in the future for groundwater in Napa County? Some of you may be familiar with SGMA, that's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That's something that was passed probably 5-6 years ago at the California State Legislature, and is essentially what is going to regulate groundwater moving forward in the state of California. Currently, right now, in Napa County, we are working through a process with the Groundwater Sustainability Plan Advisory Committee, which is currently in our last meeting coming up. I think I have a typo here. I think it's Tuesday next week. But we should plan to move forward our groundwater sustainability plan, which is a pretty robust plan, which has recommendations on how groundwater will be monitored, regulated, and built in a sustainable manner so that over the next 20 years we don't get ourselves into a problem here. So very important that everybody's at least aware of that. The next steps in that process, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, which is currently the Board of Supervisors in Napa County, will be looking to finish up this process by the end of the year. And I think it's incredibly important that your comments are heard at this point, as it will undoubtedly affect your business in one way or another. We do have the chair of the advisory committee here in the room, so if it's David Graves, can wave. If he happens to be around after we're all finished with this, feel free to ask him about additional questions on the timeline or what some of the components are. But definitely get engaged if you're not. I think everybody needs to hear with some smart ideas and understand what that may have as an impact on your business. Okay? Last little bit here on that topic. It's a pretty long plan. We've been working on this since summer of last year. You can see we're currently in this draft GSP area where hopefully at our next meeting we can move forward a final plan. And then basically our plan is due to the Department of Water Resources in January, and they will have some time to review it and tell us what we need to do to be compliant with that. I wanted to throw this up here because groundwater is something that we don't necessarily understand entirely. A lot of people have different ways of looking at that. Some people put a well in and never monitor it, never know anything about it until we have a problem. As many of you are aware, you probably had some issues with groundwater this year or heard about them from other folks. I wanted to put up some data from a vineyard that I work with here in Yountville. This is a well that's currently in the pretty robust monitoring program, which if you in the future want to donate your data or talk to the county about having your well included in the monitoring program, that's something that is always welcome. Groundwater in general is fairly stable across the entire valley and certainly the Napa River Basin. I wanted to put in here a quick, this is basically data all the way back to 1965, if you can see it on the far left, and out here on the far right, all the way up to midsummer 2021. So here's the 1976 drought, and this well that I work with just down the street, you could see some of our groundwater levels are the lowest they've kind of ever been since that's been monitored in the past 60 years. You can see over here on the far right, this is where we were at earlier this year, and on track to start to have a problem here if we don't have rainfall coming our way. I can say with some confidence now, because I went and looked at it today, what the reading actually was. It hasn't been updated on the county website, but this reading is all the way back up to our normal baseline level with the significant rain that we had. So hopefully the rest of the wells in the county are showing a similar effect, but I did want to share that with everybody. So again, your comments are definitely needed, and make sure to comment if you're concerned about that. Okay. Any questions on that before we move on to kind of the viticulture stuff, which is definitely more fun? Okay, great. If you have any, ask David later. Okay, so getting on to the talk of the day here about water. This is on the top of our minds. I always want to sort of bring this slide up when I give a talk, because it kind of highlights that what we deal with today in farming in 2021 is not a unique thing. This is a quote by Columella, some of the earliest agricultural writings in Roman times. My paternal uncle, Marcus Columella, used to shelter his vines about the rising of Sirius with palm mats, because usually during that period, some parts of the district are so troubled by the east wind, which some of the inhabitants call vulturnus, that unless the vines are shaded with coverings, the fruit is scorched as if it were with a fiery breath. So here we are 2,000 years ago with a guy in Rome having major issues with his vineyards, much like we're having today. So none of the things that we're talking about today are unique to this time period. It's hard to grow grapes, and weather is always something that we need to be concerned about. Important to note that Sirius comes up in this area midsummer, kind of a late July, I believe, in that area. And the east wind is not unlike our north winds here in Napa. So a little bit of context. We're not alone in trying to solve these problems about growing the best grapes you can throughout history. Now for some data. Everybody's acutely aware of the lack of rainfall that we had last year, but I wanted to put it down on a slide. This is from about right around St. Helena area. On the left-hand side, if you can read that, is our cumulative total rainfall for the 2020-21 water year, which is October to October. And you see that in this particular spot, we got just under 14 inches of rain for the entire year. Now, normal rainfall for that area is about 30 to 36, depending on where you are. And so it's a very significant reduction in rainfall. Interestingly, note when the rainfall actually happened. So the biggest rain that we had, and kind of the only important rain of all of last winter, was right there in the end of January, early February, where we got about 3 to 3.5 inches at one sort of storm, one time. That's the one storm event that made our creeks run for a brief second, filled up some of our ponds, and created a really good wetting front to get down into the soil. On the right-hand side is just inches per storm, and you can see that on one day we had almost 1.5 inches, but for that cumulative storm, it's close to 3 inches. Fast forward to this year, everybody remembers that we almost got flooded out here in Yountville a week or two ago, and this is a tale of different vintage for sure. We've got up to 14 inches, more than last year, the entire water year, in just one single storm. So today, cumulative rainfall, we're looking at well above that area. Now that 8 inches of rain that came down, 8 to 10 inches and more in some places, a lot of it went into the ground. A lot of it really filled what was a very deficient soil profile and got us back to sort of normal conditions. Okay. Now, last year, I don't know if anybody did any soil pits, but you would have seen some really interesting phenomenon. In heavy soils, we started to see an effect that, in places we had 12 inches of rain, normally that's enough to completely refill a soil profile, but not in the pattern that we got it last year. So having only one rainfall event that had more than a couple inches didn't create a big enough wetting front in a lot of soils to get past the deficit from 2020. So you can see the line that I drew here on this soil pit is basically at about 4 to 4.5 feet right there, and below it the soil is completely dry. And so we have and at the bottom of the pit we get back into residual moisture from 2020. So in this particular case, which is probably kind of like an average Napa bale loam series, we have a condition where we did not completely refill the soil profile in the 2021 vintage. And that created, as everybody knows, a very, very, very problematic condition for those types of vineyards. The important effects of that, what's actually going on, let's see if I can get back to that slide there. It's hard to see in this photo, but there's actually a lot of roots down in this area. This is a vineyard that normally doesn't need a lot of supplemental irrigation. We can get by with 20 to 40 gallons per year, depending on how hot it is, and just do it a couple times during the year. But this particular vineyard needed a lot of irrigation this year, simply because a lot of the roots persisted. They're naturally in this dry area. And one of the major effects that can happen when we start out a season with completely dry soils is we're getting all of the stress hormones that we typically get late season, and they're happening very early. Those stress hormones are ABA, abscisic acid, and then ethylene. We saw conditions this year in quite a few vineyards where these stress hormones that would typically come on around June and July and be huge benefits from a wine quality standpoint are actually happening before bud break. So how did we get through some of this stuff with the vineyards that we did have water? So overcoming some of those effects, a successful strategy was typically a bud break irrigation. In a lot of vineyards this year, that was frost control. We had quite a few days of frost. Irrigation around bloom made sure that we had pretty good set and a good crop. Another one around hard seed is pretty critical time when we have these types of dry conditions, and then the tail end of veraison. In a lot of vineyards, we kind of ran out of water at that point in time, and so we didn't quite have the ability to do a 20 to 22 bricks irrigation, but where we did, that's how we managed to turn what would be a very catastrophic year into something successful. Those are the key trigger points. Some of the tools we used to overcome some of these effects where we didn't have the water to start with, ponds were dry, wells were sputtering, having issues, early disking, killing that cover crop as early as possible, mowing tight, getting on our weed management, a robust foliar nutrition program, and that's something that I'd like to discuss more in the panel later today, what people worked with. And then, of course, significant canopy restrictions. So really working on total leaf area, and not just total leaf area, but which leaves and when. Let's talk a little bit more about our hormone effects. The ABA, one of the most important things as we talk about ripening, it's a stress adaptation hormone. In a normal year where we have completely rain in April, rain in May, we have a completely full soil profile, we don't start seeing ABA effects, as I mentioned, until we get into some sort of significant drought status, some sort of water deficit, typically June and July. ABA is incredibly important for stomatal control. We need to condition our stomata with multiple sort of light stress events. That helps us build older, thicker leaves that are more equipped for late season deficits. Incredibly critical for fruit quality. So ABA at the right time is a very, very important hormone for us to control berry size, rate of cane lignification, and then the timing of onset. And then, of course, veraison uniformity and color intensity. And then, as Steve mentioned, phenolic development. The other major stress hormone that we're concerned about is ethylene, and incredibly high stress, so very acute stress events really stimulate ethylene production, and we generally try to avoid large hormone bumps like this until we get close to harvest. Ethylene plays an important role in ripening. It's meant to increase accumulation of phenolics in the berry, stimulates that pectin breakdown, triggers leaf and flower senescence. induces leaf abscission and yellowing, and then also for us, induces root hair growth, and that's something that we need to think about in light of dry soils from last year. Now, who saw a vineyard like this year? There's a lot of people. This is something that heavier soils, farther south county, there's a lot of vineyards that look like this. You could drive through Carneros and see a lot of these from the road. This is a photo in July. It's a cane prune vineyard. This particular vineyard will have no crop next year. There's really no cane to lay down for next year. It's going to be a very interesting one. There was not much crop this year as well. The reasons for this, obviously, these vines have been watered in the past, and this is the first year that they never really received any early water. We have some late mowing. We've got no disking. We've got all sorts of things here that are making this situation even worse. But this is a vineyard that's used to some supplemental water its entire life and received none of it this year and started out with relatively dry conditions. This is a problem. This is an economic problem. This is a long-term vine health problem. This is something that should be avoided at all costs. So hopefully not everybody raised their hand. And if that's your vineyard, I apologize for showing it. I won't name any names, although I don't see them in the room, so I think we're good. All right, so there's a lot to learn about last year. It was such an anomaly last year. I want to show some really crazy photos that some of you may or may not have seen. This is what happens when we take things too far. And not everybody gets to see this, but thankfully, we have a lot of examples of where we take it too hard this year. And this is early season cavitation. The photo on the left is just after hard seed. You can see banana yellowing of the canes. You can see an early onset of lignification. This is literally like a week after hard seed. And 2 weeks later, we have a fully lignified cane on the right, and we have raisening berries long before veraison. Now, this happens in normal years if you look closely. If you have high heat exposure on these berries, if they're out in the light, we can get this sort of complete cavitation. To compare this to some sort of measurement, we're able to say that this is kind of in the 18 bar leaf water potential range. It's on a particularly bad rootstock for drought tolerance, 101-14. And it turns out the vineyard ended up being fine, but it is something that is kind of noteworthy. Now, for something really exciting, here's extreme cavitation on similar vines late in the season. This is what happens when you definitely run out of water, when you had water before. So this is something to avoid at all costs. It may be a little hard to see on the screen here, but this leaf color is gray, and every single leaf in the vineyard is crunchy. And this happened in a span of about 2 days. We don't need to relive all the weather events, but everyone remembers we had some vapor pressure deficit events that were well into their 6s and 7s, north wind events. Thankfully, we dodged all of the smoke and the fires. But this is what happens when a vineyard starts out with a lot of water and then basically is given none during that particular event. It highlights one important thing, and that is conditioning your vineyard for long-term stress or these big acute stress events is incredibly important. A vigorous vineyard going into a complete lack of water can actually cavitate and in some cases die if it wasn't recoverable at this point. So before this turned crispy, it had a leaf water potential of 20 bars, midday. Okay, so what irrigation talk wouldn't be complete without a little note on dry farming? That's a loaded question. We don't need to get into the nuances of that. Dry farming in this context basically means no supplemental irrigation. It is possible. We've done it for generations. Some vineyards are better at it than others. This is a newer vineyard in the foreground here that is 6 years old, and for the last 3 years has had zero supplemental water at all. And it's on 110R, and basically this year was the best year it's ever looked, partly because These vines have been conditioned for the past few years. They were ready for this exact event. We were able to disc it in March, which, check your erosion control plans. A lot of people in a hillside situation can't do this. That is just something to check into. I think if we would have waited till April here, we would have seen a worse condition. We do extreme vegetation control here. When I say extreme, every lateral is gone. Every shoot tip is cut. Every young leaf is taken care of in this vineyard, and it's just old leaves. We do some very proper timed foliar nutrition, and then obviously a long-term plan of balanced soil nutrition. So taking a young vineyard, a very young vineyard, and conditioning it for dry farming is something that is certainly possible. And in this particular case where we saw about 9 inches of rain this year, did just fine. Okay, got to talk a little bit about roots since we're at ROOTSTOCK. Sorry, bad pun there. Somebody got that. It's good. Thanks, Emily. Emily and Sonia got that. Roots are alive, obviously, no need to talk about that. The life cycle of roots are something that we need to be very, very, very cautious of during these major drought events. Sometimes we think, well, let's just go ahead and water it every week. If you have the water, that's fine. If you don't have the water, we need to start thinking about how roots are growing and how our interventions are actually keeping them going. Most nutrient and water uptake happens in root tissue that's around 3 to 15 days old. And so thinking about kind of that 2-week lifespan of the section of fresh root and thinking about how you might match your irrigation to that can really change your ability to save water. Something as simple as switching from a weekly irrigation to every 2-week irrigation can be a major savings in your vineyard. Just the basics, suberized roots are still alive, but take up water and nutrients much more selectively. And young roots tend to take up water very fast and lead to very quick reductions in leaf water potential. The next slide is really what I want to get at. Getting the opportunity to see something we've never seen before in the North Coast, which is completely dry spring conditions. It's important to talk about a root flush. When I went to school, we talked a lot about, oh, there's a root flush, you always need to water at these times, this is where there's the most roots. Basically, a lot of that can just be thrown out the window. Roots basically come out at all times during the year. There are obvious peaks and there are obvious times where they don't. The important thing is that we match our management program to really either get more of that or less of that when we want it. This year, when we get our spring flush, which is basically once we give a full canopy, we've got excess carbohydrate, we get a whole bunch of new roots growing into hopefully wet soils. This year we didn't get that. It's important to note that warm soil temperatures and adequate moisture are the two major drivers of this. Some of you may remember that in March we had one of the coolest starts to the year, and then another taper in April where some of our soil temps really didn't reach typical temperatures that we're looking for. I went to go look at some data from some vineyards that we have, and it's a little bit noisy. But compared to prior years, we saw soil temperatures lag in the initial part of the year by several weeks over their normal. I didn't have a great way to show that on screen, but there was a major cold soil phenomenon, and many of us saw that in the frost control problem. We had more days of frost this year. If you happen to grow Pinot Noir and you saw effects of Pinot leaf curl, which I saw a lot of this year, I think we can officially say that it's not just a phenomenon of like spring fever and all the other things. It can be dry, cold temperatures as well. We used to think it was excessively wet soils that causing a lot of that. Soil temperature is a major component as well at this point. And other peaks, obviously, in the root flush depend a lot on our cultural activities and the weather. I'm just going to jump through the concept here of how drought tolerance is inherent in different plants, oftentimes related to their genetics. Aquaporin is one of the proteins really responsible for mitigating water flow and things in and out of the plant. But rootstocks have, because we're at rootstocks have very different sort of amounts and ability to regulate this role of aquaporin and how much nutrition and water is taken up in and out of the roots. I just want to mention here some other tricks for drought effects, increasing our phosphorus, increasing our just overall availability of nutrition is important. But going back to the hormones, ABA has a very clear response in how much of this gene expression of aquaporin, how much conditioning of these roots can we get. So some of these early and light stress events can really set us up for great drought tolerance. And you look back at that vineyard that was dry farmed there for multiple years, there's a history of regular stress events that have really conditioned that vine to be set up to deal properly. Okay. A little note on root architecture. Every time we get into a vineyard, oftentimes in our head we always think of roots in the north coast. They look something like this, where all the roots are under the emitter. Every single vineyard I've ever dug up looks more like this, where we have some roots under the emitter, but most of them are under our feet, across the row, 5 feet deep. They're really out there because we have a lot of residual moisture during the wintertime. When you see it in practice, looks a little different than that crude drawing. Apologies there. This is a 2-year-old vineyard where we are training to get away from supplemental irrigation, so essentially training it to dry farm. First few years are really critical. You see year 1 roots all the way down to the bottom of the soil profile, about 4.5 feet here. Year 2 roots, and then this is dormancy period. So if we dug this vine up again, you'd find roots all across the soil horizon at all depths in the first year, and very few roots over here under the actual drip emitter outside of year 1 roots. Root architecture sets us up for the classic plumbing problem, where we oftentimes think roots are here, we water to here, but really we're only watering 15% of the soil, 15% of the root mass, and we're generally underwatering to keep up with stress events. One of the strategies for that we've worked on in our business is to get away from this weekly watering and focus more on kind of some bigger drinks. And this year, a lot of vineyards that paid off. The amount of times where I had conversations with growers where they say, well, I've got 40 gallons per vine. How do I use it? The quickest way to get to that answer is, well, use it early and then save just a little bit for the end. And one of the best ways to do that is not to meter it out in 2 gallons at a time over the season, but put down some real soaking moisture so that we can get some of this moisture down deep, where some of our older roots have an opportunity to create new root hairs and explore and grow in soils that are going to be better buffered from high temps and low humidity. So this is a neat way, if we don't get more rainfall this year or rainfall in the spring, start thinking about delivering your water in a slightly different amount. I wanted to show this slide for what that looks like in practice. This year we did a lot of bud break irrigation or overhead irrigation with frost. Broke these up into kind of critical, berry, where it's important for berry health and vine health, bud break, flowering, potentially here close to lag phase. If we have a large crop, we're looking to elicit more malic acid. And then tail end of veraison, so we can get a little bit better color development. And then again at around 20 to 22 bricks, and then post-harvest if you had it. There's a lot of vineyards where we didn't do the post-harvest this year because we didn't have the water, and thankfully nature fixed that for us, which is why all the leaves aren't falling off yet. Okay, so as we wrap up here, leaf age is one of the things I mentioned as a major component of reducing total water use in the vineyard. If we can skew some of our vineyard to have older leaves and less efficient less efficient water users, which the young leaves are, we can cut them out. We can really cut down on our water usage quite a bit. In practice, that's, not a lot of canopies look like this last year, but cut every last one of these off and we can save a tremendous amount of native soil moisture and skew our leaf total number of leaves to somewhere in the 14 to 18 range, and then also make them essentially all older leaves. So as I mentioned, removing every single lateral, that has a huge impact on total water usage. Those young shaded leaves have a really hard time regulating their stomata, no matter what kind of stress you throw at it. Let's see. The last slide that I have here is just a little bit of a primer on drip irrigation and some of the concerns that we have about switching only to drip is, we often think we can keep a vineyard alive forever with drip irrigation. In reality, all we end up doing is delaying our inevitable drying trend of soils here. If I didn't water at this point, I would have run out of water somewhere around here. If I didn't water at this point, I would have run out of water somewhere around here. And we can really flatten this curve, and that's something that is incredibly important to think of as we get into these months of August and September. How do we guard ourselves so that we don't get that cavitation event that I showed you in one of those slides there? And then the last little bit on ethylene, it is a hormone that we love, but we love to have it only at harvest. And if I can add a few more things to Steve's talk, this is how we get better color. This is how we get better balanced wines, is actually having some yellow canopy when we're ready to pick and on our own terms. And so with that, Steve, you should include this slide here if anybody wants to get into the biochemistry. This is that pathway, the flavonoid pathway, and important to note that all these genes are upregulated here, so better production of some of the flavanols, more catechin even, the color pigments, the stable pigments, malvidin-3 glucoside, some of those drought stress really favors a lot of the production of those. And we're going to go ahead and move on to our panel at the moment. Okay, so any questions? Or we can just talk about them at our panel. So maybe Sarah and, where's Justin? Sarah and Justin, come on up and we'll take questions directly on that. Okay, so we already did a few introductions, but I want this to be a little bit kind of an open panel as well. So this is meant to talk a little bit about some of our experience in 2021 and some tips and tricks that we might have to a little bit more of a resilient farming in the future. Assuming that we could have another year like this or another year that's twice as wet, we need to be thinking about our water relations in all aspects here. So one of the questions that start the conversation is sort of a conversation around technology and what are some of the helpful tools and technology components that we're using to measure stress and help guide us in some of our irrigation programs. And we'll start that off with Sarah, and maybe you have some ideas on that.
Sure. I think we have a lot of really great tools to be able to measure stress. And some of the tools that we use, you pointed out where the roots are. So soil moisture probes have been really helpful, knowing where our roots are and how the water is moving through the soil after irrigations, how they're drying up. That's been one really great tool to see what we have available, and then also to help see when we should start irrigating. And with soil moisture probes, it's always really helpful to have a year's worth of data before to see where our thresholds are, where it starts to dry up, to be able to get to that point to see, well, maybe we have a little bit more left. We can wait a little bit longer depending on the water that we have and our program. Other tools that we use are direct measurements of vine stress. So leaf water pressure or leaf water potential is one that we have a lot of experience with. Other is a pyrometer, and then also Thule vision. So ways to measure stress from a direct measurement from a vine. And those are helpful to choose the samples that we're taking it from. And another tool to use for that is NDVI measurements, so we can see the variability like Steve Price showed and take measurements that will help us make decisions for irrigations. And then more of a broad bird's eye view is looking at ET. So a sensor that will measure ET and be able to see over time how it's changing. That's also something that we've been using too.
Yeah, any additional tools or technology that you kind of employ in your vineyards, Justin?
Anything that can help with your irrigation system, float switches and wells, and keeping all of that intact, I think is really important, and having that telemetry built in as well, I'd add.
Yeah, do either of you work with a lot of systems that are looking to automate some of these processes, or still just give you information that you can execute on?
Yeah, we have a couple of them out there. I would say that it's definitely not full automation. It's more like taking the steps in between that, if it's just opening or closing an electric valve, maybe a remote start on a generator, float switch on a well that's filling tanks, but you still have people there and they're monitoring things. They can just be much more efficient. But I think it does save a lot on time for us.
Agreed, us too. Being able to program something or being able to respond and turn it on, so automated systems. Flow meters have been really helpful to see if we want to send out an irrigation, actually how much water are we putting out there, and so those tools have been great.
Yeah, one of the things that I really enjoyed this year was looking back at some of our ET data, so specifically using the Thule stations, some real early signatures. We can see this vineyard with no water stress show up at times that I've never seen it, and some of these things are really impressive to watch and see really how those vines respond. Some of the other sap flow sensors kind of showed some early on some really major problems. Some of these cavitation events coming up early. I think being able to use these tools in this situation really paid off, and I think for me allowed me to make a much better decision on how to use some of this precious water. I go back to what we do in the MST. If any of you farm in Coombsville, we're already water restricted in a lot of cases, at least from using groundwater. And it was an exciting effort to take 0.3 acre feet and kind of apply that to the rest of our farming, because in a lot of cases that's all we had where we had ponds. And using these tools, I think, added a level of confidence that we could apply the right amount at the right time. And so I think the definite advocate for use whatever you can, whenever you can. Anyone in the audience have any other tools that we didn't talk about? Some of the ET sensors, sap flow sensors, pyrometers, anything else that you're using or you used quite a bit of? Yeah, continuous leaf temperature sensors. Yeah, that's a neat thing. I think in prior talks here, we've kind of shown some of the canopy temperature metrics are really important ways to find that trigger point to where the vines are able to keep up with this natural moisture, or do you need to work on supplemental moisture? Was that a tool for you that worked all through the season, or is there a time where that was working better this year?
Well, you can't really install until you have full canopy, so some of that early season stuff, like you mentioned, you won't be able to capture that. But later on, it's great.
Excellent. I won't ask you what the cost is on it, but one of the things there that I like about this is a lot of this technology has really come down over the years in cost, and is something that the people that I work with were able to implement 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 different technologies in one vineyard because they're completely affordable at this point.
And I just wanted to add, I could imagine in a more normal year when we start with full soil profiles, that having leaf temperature when canopies are already grown would be useful, as opposed this year we were focusing on making sure that we got proper canopy height early, and so the early tools and early irrigations were vital.
Yeah, another one that we used was the now, but whatever we can get that kind of gives us something ahead of what's happening rather than being reactive would be helpful.
Yeah, I think if you can speak into the mic, that way the folks online can hear us. But that's a great tech, and if you can talk a little bit more about it, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the VSIM, we get, basically it says, when you get your report, it says if you don't water, this is what your leaf water potential is going to be next week. So that's a really useful tool, giving us a forecast of where our water stress is going to be, rather than so many of our tools, which are, trailing indicators.
Anything to add on that?
Oh, I think that's a good point. Just being able to integrate information and use it together for forecasting, looking at historical information. So anywhere we have a weather station, to be able to see what's happened in the past, what we did in the past in response to certain heat events. Just being able to integrate that information is great. It sounds.
So a couple other items that I'd love to, touch on. We talked a little bit today about some of the other cultural practices that, we can use to kind of soften the effects of a major drought. Obviously some of the vineyard floor management is a major component of that. Justin, you want to talk a little bit more about the tools that were successful on the vineyard floor management and some of that?
Yeah, Garrett, you did an excellent job with a lot of the details. I'll kind of stay a little bit more generalized. And first, I would say every vineyard's different. We all know that, and so it's hard to just say, well, this is what you should do here, and this applies to everything. But I think there are some basic things, like when we're pruning, I think monitoring what the water status is of the plant and getting an idea of what you're going to be dealing with that season is important. I think we saw a lot of really dry wood when we were during the pruning season, and knowing that we didn't have a lot of rain, that was a really good kind of indicator that, okay, this is going to be a dry year. What can we do? What do we need to do? And sitting down and getting a comprehensive plan of what your resources are, so that you're not the last week of August and a heat wave's coming, what am I going to do? So that you're starting at the very beginning of the season with, okay, normally I'm going to put out 60 to 80 gallons of vine. Well, this year it might be 20. Okay, so if I can only put out 20 gallons of vine, when am I going to use it? And just starting at the very beginning of the season and knowing, okay, well, normally I might put out some water early, but since I don't have that water this year, maybe I'm going to mow and till a little bit earlier. Maybe there's some different things that I can do. I can sucker a little bit earlier. I can understand that the canopies are going to be smaller because the root systems are going to be smaller, and really looking at the whole picture together and seeing where you can have the biggest impact and be the most efficient. And I think a lot of that comes down to just knowing what you got, taking a look at your block and understanding the rootstock, what's your normal pounds per plant target, what your quality targets are like, what the stylistic, goals are for potential winemakers or whoever you're working with, and understanding where we can put those vines in the best balance for that vintage. And I think a lot of that is, with 2021, it was mowing and disking potentially in March, or early April, which was kind of crazy for most years, but that's what the season gave us. And I think that had a really big impact, removing the competition early, understanding that suckering earlier was going to be better, and then balancing your crop load earlier rather than later, and preserving the water you had for when you thought you would need it the most, depending on whatever kind of irrigation strategy you have.
Yeah, knowing that we typically get a few inches of rain in April and May, I found it kind of hard to pull the trigger on some vineyard floor activities. That was kind of an internal struggle, going like, well, what happens if I take this cover crop out and I get 6 inches in April, which is totally common?
Yeah.
Am I going to keep myself out of the field, or end up with a really wet condition later on?
I know your cost is going to go up right off the bat when you're mowing early.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was something that found a definite struggle with. And then the other one I mentioned is the erosion control plans. In a few places, we use this opportunity to refresh our cover crops, and go through and disc out an aged cover crop on a hillside that was kind of full of weeds and ready to be refreshed anyway. Do either of you have you made any changes to some of your cover crop strategies this year? You know, we always farm perfectly for the prior year. Did you think about some of the cover crop strategies going into this so that you're a little more buffered potentially for next year?
You want to take it first? Okay. Yeah, as Garrett mentioned, renewing cover crops I think is an important part of our vineyard floor management. And I've found that typically they work in about a 3 to 4 year cycle of where either you need to reseed because the native vegetation has taken over or they've become almost too competitive. And in the first year you might seed and your plans are for alternate row or permanent cover crop and things look pretty good, you don't notice much of a difference. Second year, everything's perfect, you know, it's right where you want it to be. Third year, all of a sudden you're going, whoa, okay, you know, this is really starting to compete with my plants, I need to look at this a little bit more. And then usually by the fourth year, unless you've got plenty of water and deeper root systems that are more adapted to it, you're going to start to see a lot of competition. And that's a good time to renew it. You could change what type of crop you're planting. If you've got legumes and you want to switch over to some brassicas and some other things. Erosion control plans allow you to reestablish every other row every 3 years typically. Depends on your engineer and how it's been approved with the county, but you can definitely do that. We also saw a lot of benefit from using a spader this year instead of a disc. You know, there's different implements you can use depending on the situation, especially for young blocks. And I think that it's really important to understand that even though we all strive for permanent cover crops from, say, a carbon kind of sequestration standpoint and for some other different reasons, it's important to be cognizant of what the vintage is telling us we need to do in order to be successful. And I think sometimes it's difficult, but those are decisions we have to make. Thinking of, we were talking earlier about some of our underperformers, let's say. For me, I think the biggest issue that I saw was where we didn't have herbicides and where we had no undervine control other than, say, weed eaters or some other implement later on in the season. Those seem to struggle the most, and so just a seasonal thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that was most helpful this year, and we've already talked about it, is cultivating early and limiting competition. And some places that it's not part of the normal program, we saw the benefit from that. And so looking at where our areas in the vineyard that need a little bit more help, using the tools that we have that may not be a typical program yearly basis, but in last year, with it being so dry, we found that cultivation for those specific areas was a really great tool, helpful tool for if we didn't have water for long-term use, making sure that we can help the canopies be strong early so that we can have a good crop later.
Right, I think, the one thing I did do a lot of this year is kind of think about changing out our perennial mixes to, some things that are a little bit less robust, and we'll end up keeping the ground together and something we can drive on late season, but maybe, shifting some of the, fawn tall fescues and the big water user stuff into some, smaller fescues and things like that. I think that's always one tool that is, hard to play the wind on that. But the other challenge that we had this year is that in some cases I didn't get that cover crop in as early as I wanted to, and we raced to get it in before the rain. I think on that front, the importance of understanding the water use of the vineyard floor is kind of really highlighted in a year like last year. When you look back at some of the published research, we can see 30, 40, 50%, depending on how your vineyard's watered, increase in sort of usage of residual soil moisture by a cover crop. Those strategies are incredibly important to understand what could be robbing it from your vines in a year where you're starting out with supplemental irrigation this early. Okay, so I think the vineyard floor component, we've exhausted that fairly well. Some other, in making up a irrigation schedule for this year, what are some other what are some other sort of thought processes that you looked at where we oftentimes have a lot of these ranches that have 2, 3, 4 different types of rootstocks, a lot of combinations of things. Can you walk us through a little bit of that, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. Also, it would depend on the year, right? So in a normal year when we can wait to irrigate when we really need it, so we'll use the tools like the soil moisture probe, the pressure bomb to measure stress, and thinking about our early stressing areas. So it could be a rootstock, specific rootstock that needs water before other rootstocks, by canopy size, depending on the size of the canopy, the age of the block. That will also determine if it's going to be on the earlier side or later side. We also have to think about what's the capacity or the structure of the irrigation system. In some cases, it takes 2 weeks to get through the whole vineyard, and so that definitely plays a part in how much and where we're irrigating. If we have a second line, we can target the weaker areas and then hold back on the more vigorous areas. So thinking about what we're working with the information that we have for that site specific, and then when we can pull the trigger for irrigations. And then there's different theories. The big drink, less frequent. I find that's the goal, where the soil can hold it and where we have the water to be able to do that. If for some more shallow rooted, either the soil is rockier, we find better response or good response for smaller drinks. And depending on weather and stress and where we are, that might be more frequent or less frequent. So thinking about all of those aspects and then developing a program around there and responding to forecasts and where the stress is in the vine.
Yeah, it's same philosophy. And just to add, times of the season where if I have limited water that I'm going to want to be able to irrigate are typically bloom and then kind of post-veraison into harvest. I sort of think, just for myself, when I'm trying to visualize or think about my farm plan for the whole season, I start from kind of Labor Day weekend, because that to me is always like make or break it for every year. It's like, where am I going to be at Labor Day weekend if we get that huge heat wave? What are my bricks going to be at? What's the ripeness going to be like? And when am I going to need to water? And then kind of work all the way back and say, okay, I've only got 3 irrigations this year, so when am I going to use them? And knowing that that's going to be my target. And I think that balancing the fruit, the yield pounds per plant to your size of your canopy can really help dial in some of those things. And I think viticulturally speaking, we tend to grow bigger canopies in Napa than we need typically for the yield from just a purely viticultural standpoint. And so I think we do have some flexibility there and can make the vines a little smaller and still accomplish things. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'd like to talk a little bit about, more and more over the past few years, we've been using misting and other sort of overhead canopy ways to cool the canopy as part of an integral piece of our irrigation strategy. So dealing with these very high stress events, these high vapor pressure deficit days, these kind of post-veraison heat waves that undoubtedly come at Labor Day every year. I don't know why we pretend like it doesn't.
It does, yeah.
Pretty much every single year. And so I'd like to focus a little bit on some of that technology and whether or not you're using it, and has it allowed you to reduce some of your cumulative water use by not having to irrigate during these 3-day windows, but just doing some canopy temperature control?
Go ahead.
Well, so yeah, I think honing in the starting point for when we turn on the systems has been something we've been looking at, and we've done a research trial using the overhead mini sprinklers, overhead misters, and seen differences in how their impacts on temperature and what how they lower temperature compared to ambient. And so the more water we've seen, it'll have a greater impact on lowering temperature. makes sense. And then the smaller, the finer mist has had a greater impact on raising humidity or relative humidity. So found using the overhead sprinklers, we can turn them on at a higher temperature. Something, I don't know if you guys have experience of using VPD instead of just temperature to turn on sprinklers, and if you guys have comments on that.
Yeah, I think so. The vapor pressure deficit, if everybody's familiar with that, is a function of humidity and temperature. But essentially, high is bad, low is normal. And so typically, we used to find these triggers of like, well, it's going to be over 100 degrees. Let's go ahead and turn on. But if we're at 30% humidity, the vines tend to do just fine, and there's no issues. So we've switched much more to using vapor pressure deficit as a guide for when to turn on, but it's a different number at different points of the season, the way that I run it. And obviously when we're most at risk for heat damage, post-coloring, post-veraison, sometimes we're lowering that vapor pressure deficit down into the high fours, 4.5 or so, instead of maybe over 5 or 6 in some cases. The cavitation photo that I showed with some of that fruit there, I did have misters there. This was just an area that it wasn't working, and so part of the reason that it did cavitate is I had not given it any irrigation, and the mister didn't have coverage, and so lesson learned. It wasn't a very big area, so I feel okay about that. But the run time is an important factor to discuss, and then also start and stop times. Obviously, the minute we turn these on, we change the humidity for sure, and then oftentimes the temperature. And so in the areas where we were limited by water or really concerned about it, we often had to find programs where we can just run for a half hour at a time and cycle them through. Other places, I was perfectly okay turning them wide open for 4.5, 5 hours a day. And then in comparison, still ending up using less water than I might by trying to deal with that stress in a traditional irrigation manner. So before we talk more about that, just show of hands, is anybody using misters or overhead cooling? There's quite a few, 5, 6, 7. Really worth looking into. From a wine quality standpoint, I think there's a real opportunity for us to get at some of the things that Steve Price mentioned on, not just berry temperature, but canopy temperature, and being able to preserve some of the real fresh aromatics in some of the varieties we're most concerned about it, and then not get to a point where we're getting heat damage that would be, dangerous to our overall phenolic profile. And then potential ripening issues, degradation of malic acid, enzymes and things of that. But can you talk a little bit more about some of the programs that how you're implementing it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so we've also looked at cycling too. So using water for half an hour and turning off for half an hour, because on the really high major heat events, we can have temperatures up to 95 at 10 in the morning, 11 in the morning in some places. So we're running it and then staying at that temperature 6 p.m., and that's a very long period of the day. So instead of in some cases we have it on that whole time, or being able to cycle. So we looked at that in one of our research trials, and similar aspects across the board for wine. But when we look at those temperature curves of probes that we have in the canopies, when we have the water on, the temperature drops. When we have the water off, it goes back up to ambient temperature. So just being able to see the impacts of that changing temperature on the wines, and then how the impacts of that. So we've seen bricks and everything looks very similar across the board for the wines, but there is a higher phenolics in the wines with the cycling. So in that 1 year trial, we saw that, and so we're analyzing the data from this year, so we should have more information. But just so having a target temperature or a target VPD to turn it on, and then where we have the water, using it fully or being able to cycle has been what we've been using.
And I would say for old systems, it's really challenging. We haven't really been too successful with trying to take an old system and converting it to a mister system. But we just put in our first one this year in a brand new development, so I'm hoping to have some more data next year. Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of flow rates are you guys getting down to in your misting system? Like if your overhead, sprinklers are 50 to 60 gallons per minute, maybe your drip is 20 to 30. What can you get down to and successfully cool?
So the question was, what kind of flow rates are we able to achieve with some of these different misting systems? Obviously conventional Rainbird overhead sprinklers can be, north of 50 gallons per acre there per minute. And I think the easy answer is, yeah, there's a pretty wide range. Where I'm looking at installing new systems or retrofitting vineyards, it's matching the output of the drip irrigation system. So in a lot of cases, we might have kind of like a current performance. All the piping is sized for 20 to 30 gallons, and that would be something I can just basically turn on overheads instead of irrigation and not have to do any additional piping for that. We can take true misting systems, so those would be with micro sprinklers, basically. So small droplet, wide throw systems that are placed every 20 feet, kind of on a grid, somewhere in that area. With true misting systems, we can get those flows down much lower, into the like sub 10 range, 5. I think probably the lowest is probably 5 that I have. Water quality is incredibly important with the misting system. I wish I had better water everywhere, but one of the major reasons why we don't go with such low flow is the treatment and keeping those misters operational for more than a few years is pretty hard. If we get to a day where we can RO all of our water and keep all the spiders out of the mister heads, maybe we can do more of those. But more and more, I think what we're trying to match is at or below the drip system so that I can cover more area. And one of the big issues, if we're thinking of installing a system, is not just its cost, but the goal for me is to use it in lieu of irrigation. So if I was going to water 6 gallons there, I would love to have the equivalent of like 3 gallons on a vine where I don't actually have to put it out as drip irrigation. That's a huge savings. So I think the best answer is whatever makes your water use a little bit lower is a really good one. You have more to add to that?
We have those numbers. I don't know off the top of my head, but the range is high. The mini revolving sprinkler is going to have a higher flow. But the thing with that is also the maintenance of those ones is significantly easier than the maintenance of the smaller misters. There's just less parts, less sprinkler heads. So there's a balance between that.
Good question. Other questions? Caleb?
So I was lucky enough to work with a micro dendrometer for a couple of years, which was going back to the technology piece, basically a little clip that was on the petiole of a leaf. And it kind of brought to light this whole concept of nighttime recovery, because that little petiole would shrink and swell, shrink during the course of the day and then swell back up at night. And you could see what looked like a heartbeat on a daily basis. And it was a really interesting leading indicator when you didn't see the recovery from our warmer nights. And it was a quick trigger to me to say, uh-oh, something's wrong here. And that ended up being an interesting trigger for me. The question is, are you incorporating some of the warmer nighttime temperatures and perhaps the lack of recovery, maybe at higher elevation sites, or when these heat waves are forecasted, into the way that you strategize or basically schedule your irrigations?
I'd say maybe more intuitively, not purposefully, like you're just the places that don't have the cooling nighttime temperature. We would see stress earlier, so that would be something that we're going to be more diligent on keeping irrigations, really keeping that schedule tighter. But one of the things we did look at, so I get back to our research trial for cooling, we did a nighttime treatment where we, instead of stopping at a certain temperature or a certain time, we extended the cooling until the evening hours, and our target there was 75 degrees or a relative humidity of 40. So that was really just relevant on those really extreme heat events where temperatures stayed in the 90s until 7 p.m. I think we went as late as 10. The thing that we noticed the most with that was that there was an impact on acid, so keeping the nights cooler in those treatments versus the other ones, the wines had higher acid. And then another anecdotal note is we noticed that the next day's temperatures were cooler. I mean, it's not really practical for what you're talking about, but just with that treatment, that was another thing that we saw.
There was a researcher out of Australia that was doing that same work with micro sprinklers under the canopy, run at night to impact the high temperatures of the next day, not necessarily to fix things, if you will, overnight. It was to increase humidity and decrease the next day's impact. So that's really cool. Thanks for sharing.
One thing I would add too is that not necessarily irrigation, but canopy management wise, maybe you look at removing more laterals and stripping those away so that it's not transpiring as much. Because I've found that, yeah, laterals are just little sugar factories, and they can really take up a lot of the resources, and especially in the warm nights where they just never shut down and they just keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I love the dendrometers, Caleb. Those are, if nobody knows what those are, basically they're these little sensitive clips that, we used to start out using them on canes. They'd measure the shrink swell. Being able to move it to a petiole has been really cool. Similar kind of data that we might see with the sap flow, in that we're getting a real-time, measurement of stress, and that inflection point is really what we're looking for. So I always use that, no matter what the technology is. What's the inflection point? Whether that's recovery from a pre-dawn leaf water potential situation or something of that matter. It's a really great way for us to kind of understand how much more time we have left before we have to do something, before there's a risk or a problem. I think any of those tools that really show that are fantastic. I mean, we see that overnight temperature as just a function of being in high elevation vineyards all the time. And so oftentimes we're having to create totally different irrigation strategies for things that are above the fog line in August, where it might get down to 70 degrees at night instead of our typical 55. And so this year, those vineyards went incredibly fast. Back to some of the ripening conversations that Steve mentioned, the hillside vineyards definitely moved quickly where we were above the fog. And then, of course, that was good this year. We didn't have more smoke exposure. Great question, Caleb. David?
I was that nightmare of the low water potential, crispy leaves situation. Was that ever salvageable? I mean, in the sense that, again, without invoking complete hindsight, would you have really gone after the canopy early, knowing that you weren't going to have enough water, or how would you have responded to that?
Yeah, so the question was the nightmare scenario I showed up of the cavitated leaves that were gray and crispy. What would I have done differently there if I would have known that was coming? I kind of knew that was coming. That area's done that before. Not as dramatic, didn't lose all of its canopy. What I did, so I instantly turned the water on, and I wasn't able to save any leaves, but I was able to rehydrate the plant. I don't expect any well, I don't know. We'll see what bud break looks like, but I don't necessarily expect any major downside there, because it only spent a day or two with, well below its water amount. And they happen to be relatively cool days post our high vapor pressure deficit. When I look back at the weather station there that we turned on, that was one of those days that the VPD was up in the 6s back at like 11 o'clock in the morning. And so it spent 8 hours in the danger zone, from a vapor pressure deficit. And for a vine that would normally get a few gallons a week there, that was enough to completely to shut it down. Now, other spots that I had different rootstocks, 110R, some other St. George, some things that have better water relations, no issues at all. And that really just highlights this, this other major component of rootstock being such a big driver of total water use efficiency. And then when we find ourselves in this danger zone, it tends to be a big problem. I look back, some of you may remember 2004, we had a really bad, really bad dry north wind. A lot of Merlot, probably 30% of the Merlot collapsed in the valley. We had tons of berry shrivel, all sorts of issues there. That was something that we saw happening a week before on the, we saw the weather, we saw some of our phytogram, the dendrometers, they were all telling us like, uh-oh, you're in big trouble. The vines didn't broadcast it, super, full canopies, no leaf water potential stress, and it just basically overnight shriveled the fruit, dropped a bunch of leaves. That was kind of a similar condition. That was a very well-watered vineyard that got into just a crisis mode. It was too much canopy for the water that it could pick up, and those cavitation events really can happen. Thankfully, it was 100 vines and not 100 acres, but it really can be something that people should be concerned with. Great question. Any other questions from the audience? Don't all speak at once. I know we have a happy hour after this, so one more question, Caleb, and then we can probably move on to the happy hour.
Yeah. Do you want me to ask you a question?
Yeah, let's
off
do
the
it.
top of my head?
What was one of your biggest failures?
Oh, jeez. Yeah, really? Thanks. I don't want to talk about forgetting to turn an irrigation system off once that ran a lot longer than it should have, but that actually worked out really well. So if you do forget your irrigation system for like 10 days, that's a strategy that works. Yeah. Justin, Sarah, and Garrett, how about a big round of applause for them?
Thank you.